Greeting his lawyer that morning, Abel suddenly replaced his formal, "Good morning, Mr. Donovan," by a warmer, "Hello, Jim." Donovan offered him a cigarette and Abel took it, saying, "Sure, I'm going to miss these." The lawyer was struck again by Abel's insight. He had markedly changed, but hardly for the better. No prison makes anyone healthier. The lawyer caught himself thinking that he'd stopped calling Abel his client. Nor was he calling him by his family name either. It was just Rudolph, like a friend. It was much later, due to the notoriety of the trial, that the well-known, if not infamous lawyer, James Donovan, realized he was parting with a friend that morning. A kind of friend that he would never, ever make again. Sleep came late that night. He woke up at dawn, feeling uneasy, moments before a loud banging shook the door. "Open up!" The man who had checked in to the cheap Latham Hotel in Manhattan got up quickly. "Open up! Colonel, we know you're in there!" In seconds, while the banging continued, he had disposed of some of the incriminating evidence. Then he opened the door. The FBI agent's conduct was rough, if not aggressive. No arrest or search warrant was produced, but the search started without delay. "We know you are a colonel with the KGB." "This must be a mistake," he repeated. The hotel guest kept perfectly calm. He understood everything, how they had tracked him down and what they knew. In the night, the Soviet resident agent had spent hours trying to receive an urgent coded message from Moscow. The weather conditions were adverse and no signal had gone through. He never got to know what the message said. Before his arrest, he had been sitting up throughout the night. He was completely exhausted because he hadn't been able to receive a message from the center. The message read, legend has it, I don't know whether it was really so, "Leave for Mexico immediately. Follow the escape plan. You'll be provided for. A vessel will smuggle you into the USSR." The FBI found bills, a checkbook, and birth certificates. 2 birth certificates. "This is for Martin Collins. Is that you?" "That's me." "What about Emil Goldfuss? Why 2 birth certificates, Colonel?" The man, still perfectly calm, said nothing. However hard the FBI agents pressed for his cooperation, they didn't get far. So immigration officials were summoned. The Soviet agent felt better. They had nothing more on him. The reason for his arrest would be violation of immigration laws. They started to draw up a report. He asked for permission to get dressed and to repack everything. They let him do that. A chance to move about the room. That gave him an opportunity to dispose of more evidence. He smartly folded the shirts, collected the toiletries, and threw away wrappings and stuff into the bin. He got dressed. The radio set was, of course, an eyesore, but that was hardly important any longer. But what was? In 1953, Americans were shocked by the Rosenbergs' trial. The couple were accused of espionage, passing atomic bomb secrets to the USSR. Evidence against the Rosenbergs was inconclusive. The legal system simply gave in to ideological pressure. At the height of the Cold War, espionage in favor of the USSR was a capital crime by definition. No evidence was needed. Both were executed by electrocution. Their 2 sons, aged 10 and 7, were orphaned. The deaths of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were a tragedy for the Soviet resident, for he had met them on several occasions. He himself shared their idealistic vision of a just world.
To them, the spies were the advance guard of the revolution. They were doing noble work. They were heroes.
The writer David Avon was a member of the American Communist Party. He understood their motives well. They did seek a more just world.
And much of that mentality remains today because of the revisionism about the Cold War and the New Left. And we've kind of returned to some of that mentality in that spies are not really spies. They're people. They're civil rights activists. They're advanced in their thinking. I mean, that mentality has resurfaced in every aspect of our society. It takes new forms, but they truly felt and even feel that they were doing the right thing.
The USA and the USSR were allies in World War II and fought against Nazism together. The American Lend-Lease program brought material to the Soviet Union. Vessels carrying goods sailed from New York across the Pacific Ocean. The movie Russia Is Her Name was being made in Hollywood.
Многие сотрудники управления стратегических служб
But many of the OSS employees sympathized with the Soviets, with their politics and aims. Even the researchers with the Manhattan Project were convinced that the atomic bomb was a weapon solely against Hitler's regime. That meant it was an all-allies affair, including the Soviet Union. The same view was held by Theodore Alvin Hall. Soviet intelligence messages codename him as Perseus.
Он был гением, юным, без образования, без всего, не коммунистом.
He was a prodigy, but not a communist, rather a leftist sympathizer. He worked at Los Alamos, where the atomic bomb was being developed.
Тех, скажем, средств, которые потом привели к атомной бомбе и к ее созданию.
In 1943, he handed the designs to the people who later became members of the Fisher spy ring, the Cohens.
Огромное количество копий чертежей.
Leona Cohen, later awarded the title of Hero of Russia, went to Los Alamos herself to meet with Perseus.
Членами вот этого, я бы назвал это так.
And still, right after the war, Perseus announced, "Enough, I am done with it." Then Fisher met him and talked him into collaborating with the Soviets a bit longer. All the other Soviet agents who had approached Perseus had been invariably shown the door. So Fisher persuaded him to work on. And that guy Perseus was a bit of a funny one. He was wearing a kind of yarmulke, and he could be wearing two different shoes, one white, one black. He was a bit out of this world, a nutty physicist, a genius. In those days, many people thought highly of the Soviet Union and believed it their duty to contribute to peaceful causes. There were also those who held communist beliefs. Morris Cohen, who fought against Nazism, was one of them. All those people shared in one idealistic dream of universal peace. To achieve this goal, they were ready to sacrifice a lot.
Но вы знаете, они, конечно, все-таки не обладали тем вот набором и навыком, который, так сказать, требовался для профессионального разведчика, особенно резидента.
What they didn't possess was the field skills necessary for professional agents.
Без всяких, я бы сказал, каких-то глупых и таких.
Fisher was delicately persuasive, never pressing.
А он показал.
And he didn't persuade them, but just demonstrated that all the responsibility and all the risk should be his.
В целях безопасности своих американских друзей.
For the sake of his American friends' safety, and trust him, they did.
Весь риск на себя.
The arrest didn't bring the effect the FBI agents sought, so they had to resort to Plan B. Martin Collins, Emil Goldfuss, was arrested for violation of immigration laws and sent to the federal alien detention facility in Texas. The unofficial investigation was begun there. According to some reports, quite definitive special methods were used during the investigation, psychological and perhaps even physical, but Abel himself never said a word about them. Initially, he refused to discuss any of the collaboration schemes. Days later, though, he asked for a pen and paper. The FBI agents were prepared to celebrate their victory. The spy was ready to give in. I am Rudolf Ivanovich Abel, citizen of the USSR, born in 1902. During the war, I found a treasure in a ruined Nazi dugout, worth about $50,000. I decided to defect to the West, and in 1948, I arrived in the USA via Canada in search of a better life. Apart from that confession, he also wrote a letter to the Soviet embassy and signed it, Rudolf Ivanovich Abel. That was all. His letter never reached the KGB headquarters. Some clerk at the embassy made a formal reply saying there was no citizen in the USSR by the name Rudolf Abel. FBI agents were perplexed by both the confession and the embassy's reply. They thought of nothing better than to make use of the spy's name, so it was given to the papers. The Soviet embassy's lack of efficiency is the reason why it was from the American papers that Moscow learned about the arrest of its chief resident agent. I'm looking through an American paper, and I see a headline. The headline is as catchy as can be. Soviet spy caught. There's a photo too. I was struck by the look in his eyes. That of an eagle captured and tied up. A powerfully piercing look. On the morning of June 22nd, 1957, a Soviet spy engaged in stealing US atomic secrets was arrested in room 839 of the Latham Hotel on Manhattan. It seemed that even the explosion of the atomic bomb would have made less noise in America. The real Rudolf Ivanovich Abel, also a Soviet intelligence officer, had died 2 years before. His best friend, Soviet resident agent codenamed Mark, knew that very well. That's why he called himself Abel. It was the name of his friend with whom he used to work. The center was to understand there was a failure. It was time to make the damage as minimal as possible. The KGB realized at once they had sent the right man to the USA. By using Abel's name, the resident was sending word of his actual arrest and was confirming that the spy ring was still intact. He was also implying that he was still in service. By then, the letters of the embassy had also resurfaced, so there was no doubt about the resident. He was still in the game. There were just a few people in the world who knew what Abel's real name was. All of them were in Moscow, working for the KGB. In 5 years' time, Donovan got to know his client rather well. The client turned out to be an intelligent and refined man of many talents, having a sense of humor and irresistible charm. The man made Donovan see many things in a different way: the world, society, and even himself. But the lawyer caught himself thinking that he learned almost nothing about Rudolf Abel. He knew the same things he knew on the first day. Well, yes, an extraordinary spy he is indeed. As for James Donovan, he was never a communist sympathizer. By the time of Abel's arrest, he had had years of courtroom experience and had become partner in Waters and Donovan, a law firm specializing in insurance risks. The Soviet spy case was clearly not in his line, yet that was an offer he couldn't refuse. It was on behalf of the US government that he was politely asked to take the case. When Abel was arrested, no lawyer was willing to take the case on. Donovan was the only one who agreed to do so. His prospective client's name was condemned by each and every paper, so the lawyer had to be prepared for the worst. It's a tough business, defending a Soviet spy who'd stolen American atomic secrets at the height of the Cold War. The first meeting with Abel was scheduled for tomorrow, and Donovan was nervous. The first thing he needed to know was the spy's real name. William Fisher was born in the United Kingdom and obtained a British passport. His parents were Russian émigrés. Both were Marxist and underground activists who'd been deported from Russia at the start of the 20th century. In 1921, their dream of returning to Russia came true. They came back to the Russia of the Bolsheviks. For those two, the power of workers and peasants was the ideal social system. As Heinrich Fischer was personally acquainted with Lenin, they were even received in the Kremlin.
У него отец, у дядь Виля,
His father, Uncle Willie, was half Russian and half German.
а мать русская.
His mother was Russian, Lyubov Kornieva.
Значит, он
So, he was a quarter German.
немец только.
In Soviet Russia, the young man's life changed dramatically. William was no longer at the London University. In Moscow, it was not easy to decide what to do next. Was it his beloved mathematics? Should he take up history of India, or perhaps drawing? Some said he had a talent, but first he had to join the Red Army and master radio operator skills. Still, he never ceased dreaming.
Он очень хотел бы.
He wished he would sail, if possible, somewhere far away, to the northern seas, to the Arctic Ocean, and to other oceans. He even wanted to join an expedition to the North Pole. He thought about becoming a polar explorer, yet the plan didn't work. He met a young girl, a harp player at a Philharmonic Society, and he fell in love with her, and courted her for a long time, and finally proposed to her. In the end, they wanted to send him somewhere into the Arctic as a radio operator because he was the best one they had. But he refused to leave because he didn't want to be away from his wife, Eleanor. He called her Elia affectionately, and whenever he left on business or she left for a trip, they sent touchingly tender letters to each other.
It happened so that he was just cut out for intelligence work. It contained everything he sought for: danger, risk, and romanticism. At the beginning, it never stood in the way of their happy lives. In the USSR, people didn't celebrate Christmas, but they did celebrate New Year's Day. He just loved that holiday. The Fishers put up an evergreen tree, and their daughter got down to her favorite occupation. She sorted out the glittering New Year toys. It seemed she was able to look at them for hours. As for Willie, he was able to watch her for hours and listen to the songs she learned to sing together with her mother. Duty trips were not a burden in those days. When in China, Willie Fisher worked together with his friend Rudolf Abel. When in Norway, they lived a family life which was ideal cover and provided years of happiness. Now it was all those memories that gave him strength. On August 21st, 1957, James Donovan met his client Rudolf Abel for the first time in Brooklyn's core building. The client was cool and calm. Well then, you stayed in the USA using faked identification papers. I'm not alone in this. By the way, the arrest warrant is my file already, isn't it? Donovan was all business and sympathy. Martin Collins, Emil Goldfuss, and Rudolf Abel. To get you out of this, I'll need to know your real name. The agent just smiled. The trap was too obvious. Let's get down to business instead. Everything that happened to him, starting with his arrest, was basically aimed at one thing: to make a double agent out of him. The carrot and stick policy was predominantly just stick. It looked like the lawyer was going to be the carrot. Originally, Fisher didn't count on any lawyer's assistance. A Harvard graduate, James Donovan served as a naval intelligence commander during World War II. He was an assistant to the chief US prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. That's why he knew very well what the Russians had gone through in the 4 years of Nazi occupation. He had no hatred towards the Russians. After the war, Donovan went into law practice, but kept his contacts in the intelligence department. That was the reason why he was chosen to represent the Soviet spy.
Донован был толковым парнем.
Donovan was a smart guy. In fact, he was a war veteran. His role was basically, as far as I see it, a dual one. Initially, he was to assist the Americans in making Abel a double agent. When he came to realize that his client was, in fact, an honest man and a good man, Donovan made up his mind to help him. During World War II, William Fisher also served as an intelligence officer. He participated in a major counter-subversive operation codenamed Berezino, which was essentially about providing false information by radio. In Berlin, they thought the messages were sent by German spies operating in the Soviet rear. In reality, it was Fisher who sent them. He was even decorated with the Iron Cross, Nazi Germany's highest award, but he preferred a Soviet medal. In William Genrikhovich's private correspondence, I came across strange phrases like, "I wish it all ended soon," or "A time will come, Elia, when I quit all this and start doing what I have wanted to do all my life, artistic work." A real war began, the Cold War. Fisher wrote a request to give him a job as an illegal resident agent, swearing to defend his motherland to the last drop of blood. More than that, he requested to be employed as an illegal resident agent. Now Fisher went on duty trips more often, yet they were not long and he spent more time with Elena. The day of parting came in 1948. He just came home and said, "I am leaving. It's a long duty trip." All talking was done at that point. In our family, we never discussed job-related matters. Such matters were never to be discussed. Elena was convinced Willie would return soon, as he usually did, but the duty trip lasted for a long 14 years. During that time, they saw each other only once during his recuperation. It was a happy time together. They traveled to Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, walked along the Neva and visited the museums. Then he was gone again. Soon afterwards, communication was lost altogether. There was no one to ask for information. Me personally, I learned it from some acquaintances who subscribed to an American magazine. I don't even remember which one. There was a picture showing Uncle Willie's arrest, and the caption read, "Soviet spy caught." As expected, the lawyer James Donovan was instantly accused publicly of collaborating with the Reds. The case stirred America indeed. His partners began to fear their firm could lose conservative-minded clients. Despite all that, James Donovan was eager to help his client. The central question was defense strategy. Donovan tried the argument of case evidence obtained without due legal procedure. Consequently, the evidence had no power in court. Abel cut him short at once. No one was going to consider this an argument, and he was right, of course. Donovan had practically no time left at his disposal. 6 days before the court began, he received a list of witnesses with 69 people on it, almost half of which consisted of FBI agents. The star witness was Vic. His confession covered 39 pages, a Soviet spy turned collaborator. His real name was Reino Hachanen. He was Finnish. In 1953, he arrived in New York as a radio operator for the Soviet resident agent codenamed Mark. In 1957, he sensed trouble. He wasted the money, and he was afraid he'd have to answer for that. The money was meant to be given to the family of Morton Sobel, who had been sentenced to 30 years in prison in the Rosenberg's trial. Fisher wanted Vic to pass the money to the Sobels, but they never saw a dime. Vic said he'd lost it all, more than $1,000. It was in the summer of 1955, and then, while driving under the influence, Vic crashed. Things went from bad to worse after that, and they went very quickly. Hachanen was destroying himself with booze. Vic feared both the KGB and the CIA, but he hoped to be well paid if he turned in a Soviet agent.
When summoned to the USSR, Vic went as far as Paris and then straight to the US Embassy. He claimed he was a radio operator for a Soviet agent working undercover in the USA. The agent had recently been promoted to colonel. The agent's codename was Mark.
Ему не поверили, потому что вид у него был ужасный просто. Это был человек...
They simply didn't believe him. It was because of his terrible look. He was rather young then, but already balding. The remaining hair was of that strange color, black, and he reeked of whiskey. Though he had spent quite a long time in the USA, he still had difficulty communicating in English.
Совершенно не научился говорить за все годы, проведенные в Штатах по-английски.
But the CIA got the message. Colonel Mark was stealing atomic bomb secrets. All the field agents of the FBI started a search for a Soviet resident agent who presumably lived a painter's life.
The notion of a heroic feat, as I understand it, this often implies someone's stupid mistake was fully compensated. To this day, no one knew how many people were involved in his spy rings. Those people were all destined to die in case Fisher failed, and the Rosenberg's fate was an example of this.
Было много очень немцев.
There were many German immigrants who settled in the USA, those who escaped Hitler's persecution. There were some people among them, this is a little-known fact, but it seems to be interesting. There were those German communists who were actual combatants under Wilhelm Tellman, who fought against Hitler's thugs in those years long ago. Step by step, they were united too. Guess who was coordinating this union? Fisher was. Mark knew he was in grave danger, so he was waiting for instructions from Moscow. He never received the message saying he had been betrayed by Vic, so he thought he'd have time to go back and destroy all the evidence. He also wanted to pass the money to the Americans.
Fisher раздавал деньги.
Fisher gave the money to Soviet resident agents and to the Americans who worked for him, who were members of his spy ring. He was an honest man. To him, the very idea of losing those great sums of money he kept in his safe was a horrible crime. A keen sense of duty won over the feeling that it was time to run for his life.
Казалось страшным преступлением.
To Fisher's studio, Vic came only one time. This actually led to Fisher's arrest, as Vic remembered the studio's location and later showed it to the FBI. The surveillance spotted Fisher when he came for the money and then followed him to the Latham Hotel, where he was arrested. Quite a large number of Bohemians lived at 252 Fulton Street, just across from the building of the Federal Court. The last 5 years, Fisher lived here under the name of the artist Emil Goldfuss. He loved the lab that he had created with his own hands, just like at home. There were lots of radio sets that he could reassemble with his eyes closed. Friends joked that he needed just 2 matchboxes to make a radio. Had William graduated from the radio technical department of the University of London, he would definitely have become one of the creators of British radar stations. He was a born radio engineer. Besides radio sets, the studio contained photography equipment. That was in vogue. Photography was making huge advances and served as a perfect cover for intelligence work. Microfilm was hidden in a safe place, and the devices for developing and copying looked perfectly ordinary and caused no suspicion.
Разведывательная техника, она просто-напросто демонтировалась.
All the intelligence devices were kept as separate components and were assembled with new functions when required. It was meant to be kept in full view, but with some hiding places within. The best camouflage is when you keep it out, so that it never causes any undue interest or attention. Easels and paintings occupied the most prominent place in the studio. This was not only Fisher's chief camouflage, but also his chief hobby. He did have a talent for painting. The artist Emil Goldfuss was indeed fairly popular among his friends. Another artist was his only true friend in New York City. Burton Silverman had just left the army, but he found many a topic for conversation with the 50-year-old Emil Goldfuss. Silverman knew not, of course, that his colleague, long before he became an intelligence officer, had entered the Surikov Art School, the best in the USSR. In fact, he didn't like avant-garde art, so he studied there only briefly and then left the school. He was attracted more to maths and other exact sciences. The two artists talked a lot about art in the Brooklyn studio. Goldfuss portrayed life in the slums of New York. He was convinced that there was no better artist than life itself. Silverman agreed with that school of thought. The two met quite often. Burton loved the coffee Goldfuss made in a strange style, simply putting boiling hot water into the coffee grains, but it tasted good. Once Burton asked his fellow artist to be his model. "You've got a very intelligent face," he said. The portrait showed Fisher in the studio and was entitled An Amateur. His explanation was that it was the portrait of a man who loves what he does. When summoned as a witness, Silverman would say many a good thing about the man charged with espionage. He wouldn't stop calling him Emil either. The hollow nickel case was the name Rudolf Abel's case got in the American press. The Department of Defense's film company made a short documentary under the same name. In 1953, a 13-year-old newsboy named James Bozard came across a nickel that broke in half to reveal a microphotograph. The microfilm was taken to the FBI, but the coded message was cracked only after Vic had provided the Americans with the code. It was Vic who had lost that nickel. The nickel was one piece of espionage evidence against Mark, but it contained no information about stealing atomic secrets, just like all the other pieces. Yet the judge and the prosecutor were determined to press for the maximum sentence. The trial was a genuine political showcase entitled Enemy of America Condemned.
Говорят, что на суде он держался.
They say he kept perfectly calm during the trial. At least he looked so. He just sat there and drew and listened to what they were saying. When he was given the last word, he refused to speak. He never said a word in self-defense. Tompkins, a 44-year-old prosecutor, was the head of internal security at the US Department of Justice. He had already had more than 100 sentences to his name. During the spy trial, he was sure he would win. The trial was in the spotlight of all the media. The jurors found themselves hostages to the political situation. America was after a foreign spy at the height of the Cold War, just a step away from the brink of a nuclear world war. A silent Caucasian man, a typical Brooklyn dweller, was in the center of the spy scandal. Death by electrocution was a danger looming in front of him. Abel had no trust in the US judiciary system. Who would bother with the fact that his guilt, stealing atomic secrets, had not been proved? Unlike Abel, Donovan was adamant in his belief in the governance of law. The lawyer insisted on reading private correspondence between the spy and his wife. The letters showed their humanity, that love is an edifying force. The jurors, there might have been some sympathy among them, but they were mostly people with FBI connections. The jurors were not allowed to be replaced, yet nothing could baffle Donovan. The lawyer was defending a man of rare integrity, unfortunate enough to have chosen the wrong government. Vic, the witness, was a striking contrast to Abel. He was a totally unsympathetic character.
Обвинений вот по существу не было.
In fact, the prosecution failed to prove Abel's guilt. The only testimony was Vic's, the only card in the hands of the prosecution. There was no direct evidence that he had stolen atomic secrets. On October 25th, 1957, Donovan delivered his last speech. Well, all right, let us assume that Abel is a Soviet spy, and never did he admit that. Okay, was he supposed to do that? Just imagine a situation. The Soviets arrest our man, and he rolls all the secrets on their table. What would you call him? My word, exactly. But this word should not necessarily go down in the minutes. Donovan played to the audience. The chief prosecutor spoke then. His verdict was the death sentence. The prosecutor stressed several times that crime committed is not an obligatory prerequisite for finding someone guilty. There was a mock verdict first. 12 jurors, 12 notes. Everyone was sure that the decision would be unanimous. The judge read the first one, and it said, "Not guilty." He was horrified and hastily started to open the others. 11 said guilty, so the score was 11-1. There was just one not guilty note. When the jurors retired during the actual trial, the verdict was unanimous. All the jurors said guilty. The 20 days until the judge pronounced his verdict, Donovan spent trying to do the impossible, that is, to save his client. He banged on all the department doors. He even went to the CIA headquarters in Washington, D.C. True, he coordinated his every move with Alan Dulles, but it was fair game. Well, fair because, on the one hand, he really tried to recruit the Soviet spy, and on the other hand, he was honest with Fisher. He also helped to free him from the deadly grip of the so-called judiciary system. Crucial was the argument that was, in essence, completely unrelated to the case. The Soviet spy could prove a good bargain in case an American spy got caught by the KGB. Bearing that in mind, Judge Byers sentenced Abel to 30 years imprisonment and fined him a total of $3,000. For Abel, aged 55, it was nothing but a life sentence. Yet Donovan and his client were celebrating. Abel was not going to be executed, so there was a chance to fight on. The trial came as a great disillusionment for William Fisher. In fact, he almost let himself believe that Donovan would persuade the jurors to vote differently, and the healthy American public, Donovan's favorite phrase, would put an end to the injustices. Consciously, he knew it would never happen, but he cherished this hope in his heart. That hope was also Donovan's. He thought before the trial, and years after, now it was time to say goodbye. The resident agent known as Rudolph Abel to the world was kept in a military prison in the American sector of West Berlin. There was a cage with a bed and stool inside. Days and days passed in waiting for the decision. It could all fail in a second if Khrushchev suddenly got the wrong idea or if Kennedy gave in to the hawks in the government. The Soviet colonel soon earned quite a reputation at the penitentiary facility, not just because his case had made screaming headlines and he had got a huge sentence. It was because he was unlike anybody else, interesting and bright. Both the security personnel and the criminals, some mafia dons among them, shared in the attitude.
Там, значит, были Genovese и Costello. Это кланы, враждующие. И, значит,
two mafia men were there, Genovese and Costello. They came from feuding families.
И, значит, состоялось, это вот он лично рассказывал.
He told that story himself. On a walk in the prison yard, Genovese and Costello made peace with each other.
Значит, полковник Абель попросил двух.
Colonel Abel made the two mafia bosses both shake hands.
Пожать друг другу руку.
The Atlanta prison had no solitary cells, and that made Fisher's spirits higher. Of course, his chosen inmate was far from an innocent one. The man was infuriated and thought it humiliating to be incarcerated next to a Soviet spy. However, a few days later, the criminal eagerly started scrubbing the floor. It was Abel's wonderwork. He convinced the man it was the best antidepressant. Later, a truly unusual thing happened. The inmate took up French with Abel as a tutor. When they decided to relocate him to another cell, he loudly protested. He hadn't yet finished with French verbs. And Fisher, why did he need all that? Probably for its own sake, for some sort of communication. To occupy his brain, previously always working at full throttle, Fisher solved math problems. It was Donovan's great surprise when Abel asked him for a Christmas present, a complete manual on mathematical analysis. Donovan's visits to the prison made the two even friendlier. The lawyer never dropped the case and continued all the way to the Supreme Court. No journalistic frenzy now, just law and plain facts. But the judiciary system played blind to the obvious. No appellation worked. Abel was guilty. The convicted man saw Donovan's distress and tried to cheer him up. "Don't worry, you've done your best," thought the lawyer. "That guy has just lost a chance to get his freedom back, and he is sympathizing with me. I can't believe this." Their encounters came to be very informal, and they joked a lot. It seemed that Abel's wit was inexhaustible. Next Christmas, he asked for another present, a tome on the history of world art. He also asked for permission to draw. Not only was the permission granted, but also, unbelievably, Donovan thought, Abel was provided with an art studio. Unbelievable indeed. It turned out that prisoner number 80016 had developed an original method of drawing on silk. the postcards he produced were popular with other inmates and, as admitted by the authorities, had a positive effect on them. He won the trust of all the inmates. Everybody respected him. Soon, Abel's studio began to produce postcards by the thousand. A day came when a postcard arrived at the Fisher's Moscow address, sent from a prison in Atlanta. Eleanor recognized her husband's handwriting. His self-portrait was drawn on the postcard. There could be no better New Year present for her. It was only in 1959 that Donovan managed to get permission for Abel to write letters to his family. The reason was unusual again. Private correspondence could help establish the spy's true identity.
Письма общего такого характера, ничего там такого интригующего не было.
The letters were quite casual, nothing out of the ordinary in them. But the Americans were still convinced that it was covert information being exchanged. So they cancelled the permission time and again. Donovan was there to restore the right to private correspondence, which was conducted via the International Red Cross.
А переписка вся велась через Красное общество Красного Креста.
Now there was something to wait for. Although he was well trained in fast reading and had photographic memory, he still read and reread those letters. His eyes followed every curve of every letter, and minute memories came alive of those few happy years in Moscow. Then, with the emotional storm in his heart calming again, he sat down to write the casual words. "I am all right. How are things with you? How is Lidочка doing?" He knew that his lines would be read by many eyes, so he didn't even try to express his real feelings. Well, that was part of his trade. Both he and his wife had learned to read between the lines long ago.
Дядя Вилли никогда не называл имя дочери Эвелины.
Uncle Willie never used the name of his daughter, Evelina, as it was a very rare name. So the name he used was always Lydia. That's why he inquired not about his daughter, but about Lydia. She was an adopted child, a niece in fact. The Fishers loved her like their own daughter. Officially, there were no papers on guardianship, and it was for the better. American intelligence could never use this information to establish Rudolph's true identity. Whatever Abel did was reported to the CIA immediately by the prison authorities. Much later, Dulles spoke about Abel in an interview published by the New York Herald Tribune. "Abel is a rare man," he said. "He is equally at home in the arts and in politics. He is a gifted artist and musician, a brilliant photographer, an exceptional linguist, a talented mathematician and physicist. Learning was his craft." But still, Abel's correspondence was terminated. It happened after he again refused the proposition to be released from prison and live at the expense of the US government in exchange for his collaboration. In all the years of trial and incarceration, that was the only thing that kicked Abel off balance. Donovan was infuriated even more. The man never broke a rule and proved useful to society, so he deserved a less lengthy prison sentence rather than the difficult conditions of prison life. It showed Abel was right again. Justice hardly existed. Donovan remembered all that one more time, standing on Glienicke Bridge, linking the Soviet and American sectors of West Berlin. Looking in the direction of the Soviet sector, he asked himself about the kind of people who lived in the USSR. Do they all look like Abel, or perhaps he was an exception? Frankly, it made sense to have a glimpse of life under socialism. They say that there are no rich people there, and everyone is equal. Donovan was nervous. Too many years and too much effort had been channeled into this case. On May the 1st, 1960, the 30-year-old American pilot Francis Gary Powers was captured by the Soviets after his spy plane had been shot down by an air defense rocket 20 miles to the southeast of Sverdlovsk. The event cancelled the planned summit in France, organized by the USSR, the USA, Germany, and France.
Когда Пауэрса сбили,
When Powers was shot down, They showed Uncle Willie a newspaper. William Fisher read through the article. It even made headlines all over the world. All his inmates knew it was his golden opportunity. Many people recollected Donovan's words spoken during the trial about the possibility of spy-for-spy exchange with the Soviets. It was time to do that. Francis Gary Powers had been taking photos of Soviet territory on a spy mission. He was sentenced to 10 years for espionage. Strange as it may seem, President Eisenhower was the first to voice the idea. Later, Gary Powers' parents asked Donovan for assistance. They also appealed to Abel to write a letter to the USSR with the request, but Abel's correspondence rights were cancelled.
Донован стал искать возможности через
Donovan searched for options through international law organizations and contacted a lawyer in the German Democratic Republic, Wolfgang Vogel. Preliminary negotiations began. Preparations for the spy exchange started in the late spring of 1960. Finalizing the plan took 2 long years. Finally, there was one last step left. This cage, how stupid of them to do that. He wanted to have a longer talk. It may well be their last meeting. The exchange was scheduled in an hour. The Bridge of Destinies, that's how Soviet and American soldiers nicknamed the Glinica Bridge in 1945. That morning, cold and windy, the waters of River Havel looked like mercury. It was the first spy exchange in the history of the Cold War. Two groups of people were opposite each other, FBI and KGB agents. Their slow walking was deceptive. Their muscles were full of lead. Gary Powers, winter hat on his head, with a suitcase full of Soviet souvenirs, a bizarre gesture of Russian hospitality. "We're ready. Begin." On a signal from the Soviets, Powers and Abel moved towards each other. Neither Eleanor nor Evelyn was invited to see the exchange. Both had to wait several hours longer. But William Fisher was walking towards them into his paradise lost, that quiet Moscow apartment. Shortly after his return to the USA, James Donovan received a parcel and a letter from the USSR. "Dear Jim, I am no old book collector, nor a lawyer, but I came across these 2 books on law published in the 16th century, and I found them rare enough to serve as a valuable addition to your collection. Please accept them as a token of gratitude for everything you have done for me. I hope that you are not going to burden yourself with too much work. Sincerely yours, Rudolph." The parcel contained 2 rare editions of Justinian Codex in Latin. Francis Gary Powers managed to collect all the payment due for all the years of CIA service and left the agency. In August 1977, he was killed in a helicopter crash near Santa Barbara, California. Reino Heihanen, alias Vic, stayed in the USA and went on drinking. He lived on welfare and died in a traffic accident 2 years after the trial. The brief news article passed unnoticed. There were no witnesses. James Britt Donovan continued his law practice. During the spy trial, he acquired important contacts in the power structures and had direct access to the CIA chiefs and even presidents. William Fisher was known as Rudolph Abel till the end of his life. He was still employed by the KGB, but he was never given any serious job. This was a source of constant pain for the veteran. Most of his time he spent in his country house. He busied himself in his workshop and even built a gazebo where he sat throughout evenings. He was also doing drawings on silk, and the images were often autobiographical.